Hello, I'm Braddock Supervisor John Cook. Thank you for watching my news program, Braddock Neighborhood News, which takes an in-depth look at the local topics most important to you and our community. The issue of law enforcement has become a contentious topic all across America, and Fairfax County is no exception. To increase transparency and pursue the re-engineering of the Fairfax County Police Department, the Ad Hoc Police Practices Review Commission was established. The Ad Hoc Commission, which consisted of community representatives with diverse backgrounds and perspectives, created a list of recommendations it felt should be implemented by the county and FCPD to improve service. This month, I've invited Ad Hoc Commission representatives Adrian Steele and Philip Nadelsky-Eichner to come on BNN and tell us about their mission of improving transparency in the police department. Adrian, Phil, thanks so much for all your work on the commission and continuing, and for coming on the show and talking to us today.
That was an honor.
Thank you.
So, Adrian, you were, I guess, vice chair of this wrangling commission, which was huge, and did a mountain of work in a relatively compressed time, less than a year.
Yes, sir.
And tell us a little bit about that experience of taking a large group of people, who many of whom didn't know each other, on a difficult topic, and coming out with really an excellent report at the end of the day.
When we were all appointed, we had our original meeting, and the chairman, Michael Hirschman, asked for folks who would be willing to help do that, herd the cats into some sort of structural sense. And there were 5 subcommittees that Mr. Hirschman established based on the work that the chairman, Bulova, had identified 5 or 6 areas, and I think the board had adjusted those a little bit and going forward, and there was a need to develop scopes of work for each of the 5 subcommittees, it turned out. So I offered to help Mr. Hirschman do that, and then we developed 5 scopes of work for the commission. Commission members were encouraged to join one or more of the subcommittees. That's one of those that Phil led on the use of force. I was on 2 of those. One was independent investigations and oversight, and use of force. And as I say, Phil led the use of force one. And then from that point, each of the subcommittee chairpersons formed their own subcommittees of some commission members who volunteered, some who were asked because of their expertise, and then community members were encouraged to join the subcommittees, so that most of the subcommittees had 5 or 6 or 7 commission members and another 5 to 10 community members of a wide, diverse nature, from economic, ethnic background, law enforcement, public community, just citizens who were concerned, people who had been involved in incidences in the past. So that worked very well. I think all of the subcommittee chairmen led their committees well. And then, as you know, each made a set of recommendations that worked its way to the board and was presented at a board meeting each time. And then the board accepted the commission's recommendations, and then worked on the Public Safety Committee, which you chair, of course, each of the sets of recommendations.
And Phil, you know, what really, I guess, prompted the commission to be established was some use of force incidents. So you took on the chairmanship of that committee. So you really had a focal point there of some difficult issues. But you had also a lot of cooperation. I think it's important for people to understand, from our chief of police, who really embraced the citizen effort to improve the relationship between the police department and our community, and talk a little bit about that relationship.
Yeah, so relative to the use of force work, it was interesting, Supervisor, because we had individuals on the use of force subcommittee who had personal direct experience with the use of force situations, and some of them quite emotional. So, and then we had others who were friends of, and then others who were 2 or 3 steps removed but had awareness of. So in addition to the officers and the police department. So it was a quite diverse and a fairly initially emotional set of engagements that had to take place. You mentioned the police chief. The police chief had one of his deputy chiefs actually assigned to our subcommittee, and he or one of his staff was always at our meetings. And what was so important to the success of our work was that they offered, they responded to questions that we posed. So part of my task as chairman was to ask these subcommittee members, okay, what issues do you want to have investigated, understood in more detail? And we posed questions. The questions were posed to the police chief and his team, and we got responses back.
Let me just one thing. In terms of their relationship in the police, we started out with the chief announcing that he wanted to identify the best practices so that this would be one of the best police forces in the country. It already is, I think, it ranks at that level now, but everyone can always be improved. And so his support was, I think, just absolutely critical. When he came in and announced that the sanctity of life was going to be the guiding principle of his approach, and that we were going to do searches for the best practices all the way across, from recruiting to diversity to oversight, that sort of gave the subcommittees the backing to realize that they weren't going to be just another committee that was going to go nowhere. And the support that he and his staff and even the line officers provided to us with input and thoughts helped us focus, helped us change some of our perceptions of what was needed. And I think without their help, I don't think we would be here with this today.
And I think too, if I could say, there was a lot of engagement, not just from members of the subcommittees but the broader public. So we had two major public hearings, I don't know, some substantial length, in which we heard from citizens about their concerns relative to police practices. All those were recorded, all of those were taken into account by the subcommittees, and then were part of the consideration when we developed the recommendations.
And you mentioned before, the emotional content of some of those meetings. I mean, we're talking about some people whose family members had been killed, talking about people in the community who had fear and concern. At the same time, you had some very good police officers who were giving you, I think, very good information and help and assistance from saying, hey, this is what it's like to be a police officer on the street. And to pull all of that together and come out with a unified recommendation that was adopted is really quite an accomplishment. And the fact that that broad group of people could work together was really a key to that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and the you mentioned the police officers involved. We went out to the training academy. We got direct exposure to the training that the officers go through, particularly in the use of a weapon, but then also in the tools of de-escalation. And that experience really informed our recommendations. And so from a use of force standpoint, one of our key recommendations was to promote de-escalation as a first response as opposed to the use of physical force. And that was embraced. And
that's really that's a national best practice. So
it is.
What really the whole commission did, and certainly Phil, your subcommittee, is you didn't just sort of sit down and go, hey, here's an idea I thought of as I was in my shower today. But you went out and you did the research and you said, what are people across the country from an academic standpoint, from a practical standpoint, law enforcement standpoint, what are they saying where we need to be? And that theme came out throughout the report. I thought Adrian on all these points.
Back when I did those scopes of work, you had to identify the issues. You had 5 subcommittees, use of force, investigations, whatever. There were a number of resources, several of which were the recent settlement agreements entered into between various cities. Ferguson, at the time, Philadelphia, Cleveland, a couple other cities. They didn't really fit our situation, but what they did do was identify the issues that needed to be considered. And so that was helpful. So we got the issue identification. There was a lot of research done, not just by me, but by a lot of people. And then we looked to apply on those issues. Each subcommittee would consider the issues and then find the best practice that would apply to Fairfax County for our demographics, our crime issues, our law enforcement issues. And I think that really worked well. There was an atmosphere, as you started off this day in your introduction, saying that it's become an issue of national debate. And I think we are now pretty much accepted as having a scheme, law enforcement scheme, that once fully implemented is pretty much about the best in the country. We are, as I understand, the police department is making presentations to other law enforcement organizations about what our new general order on the use of force that Phil can talk about.
And one of the reasons why I think that's the case is that a key subtext of our work was the Police Executives Research Forum work on use of force, and they had a whole set of recommendations. And in fact, we embraced all of them but one of their recommendations. So when you have a national organization like PERF, or Police Executives Research Forum, and then and our embracing of that, and then filling in the gaps where we thought existed, then I think it gives a powerful set of recommendations, and hopefully, I believe they were very, very influential. I did also, though, want to note just quickly that these were working subgroups, and so Adrian mentioned these studies. We had individuals who took a study, read the study, and then reported on the studies and the key findings relative to Fairfax. And so that was a kind of an underpinning piece of activity that was, all of our people were put to work, is what I'm saying.
And we even had, like, for instance, take a topic, body-worn cameras. One of our subcommittee members went out and learned all he could about that and then reported back to the other committee members. So it wasn't just the issue identification and resources. Somebody went out and would read all of the reports, including the PERF, CALEA. Same thing happened on investigations. We had input from the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, NACOL, hard to remember the actual name. Same thing. People will get out and look at the issues about auditors or about civilian review panels, so that the committees could then, even if everybody couldn't do the work, because people had different time commitments, but we still need their inputs, they would come and we would work towards consensus.
And that was a tremendous amount of work. I mean, the amount of reading that was done, collectively, when you add up all those individual products, and then the discussion was tremendous. The community input was great. Phil, I think one of the things that maybe really helped in the use of force area, and certainly in the breadth of what the commission did, is we're really fortunate in Fairfax County that while we do have violent crime, we do have gangs, we do have drugs, compared to most other jurisdictions, our level of violent crime is very low. What we do have, a lot of our police interactions are with people with a mental health challenge, emotional disturbance, domestic disputes. We have a variety we're a county of people from all over the world who live here, so a lot of diversity in ethnic background, language, and that kind of thing. And so the commission ended up looking at a broad array of things, didn't have to focus just on the issue of, boy, when SWAT's going into a drug hornet's nest, how do you go in? Because it's probably only one way. But really had the ability to say, wait a minute, we're getting calls from, what do you do when it's a domestic disturbance? What do you do when you find out that it's a mental health issue? And then digging into that wide array of circumstances, and then coming together on this philosophy of sanctity of life and saying we want to de-escalate, slow things down, because that's the best way to handle this. You couldn't have done that in if it was Watts in 1968. You wouldn't be talking about de-escalation, right? Because you'd have such a more violent starting place.
Yeah, and to your point, Supervisor, people would find it interesting to know that in 2015, there was 0 officer-involved shooting in Fairfax County. In 2016, there was 1 officer-involved shooting. So that kind of puts our analysis in context. However, we did have a very unsatisfactory circumstance that was a catalyst for the board to act and appoint this group, and we have to acknowledge that as well. I mean, officers on a day-to-day basis are confronted with very challenging circumstances. They handle them phenomenally well for the vast majority of times. Sometimes they mess up, and that's where some of our work, in understanding those circumstances came into play.
Another, I guess, maybe sub-theme that comes throughout the report across the issue areas is community confidence.
Yeah.
Right? A communication subcommittee that said we're going to build confidence in the community by being more transparent, communicating quicker, more fully. A use of force doctrine that says we're going to de-escalate, we can consider a wide array of circumstances. A diversity subcommittee that said, hey, we need to make sure that we have language issues and ethnic background issues covered across the county. This theme throughout, and then the establishment of a civilian review panel so that citizens will be directly involved in assessing how our police are doing. Talk about the importance of that kind of community connection, both from the standpoint of making it effective policing. It helps the police to have the community behind them, and the community confidence that we'll get out of it.
I'll start in the field.
Yeah, no, I want you to.
Well, I think it's referring to the incident, the John Gear incident, in 2013, I guess. Much of the concern there was the transparency of the communications. And so that was sort of the starting point. And that communications subcommittee, and the board in particular, spent a lot of time after looking at the recommendations from that subcommittee to come up with what we now have, a scheme in which when there's an officer involved shooting and there's a serious injury within 10 days of the event, the police chief is to identify the person, this officer involved, unless there's mitigation for safety issues. While that's going on, he is to provide updates to the extent he can, consistent with constitutional rights of possible subjects, and privacy and the need to protect the officers, which is very important. So that, I think, has been a significant change in the view, and the chief is very much for transparency. You see this in his news conferences. So that is going. We have Julie Parker, who's a civilian director of public affairs, which was one of the recommendations. She's on board. She's very experienced in this. She's a reporter and spent several years at Prince George's County doing the same thing that she's doing here. There's transparency elsewhere through all the recommendations, I think. I think if you can build that up, and they have a trust, the public has a trust in what we're doing, what the police department is doing, then I think you'll find they understand the tensions and the pressures that Phil was talking about. The civilian oversight, civilian review panel that is currently being, I guess, considered by accepting nominations through the end of this month, I think, and then the panel will be selected by the board through a process that's been publicly announced. I think that's key. The two forums that you mentioned, we heard 3 or 4 topics that I don't think any of us had thought about, and that when we raised them with the police department was willing to discuss, and we figured out ways to deal with them. So I think that two-way communication is critical to that.
But part of what your question drives toward is the importance of trust in a relationship between the citizen and the officers who are empowered to protect them. When that trust is jeopardized in some way through either real action or perceived action, it has an impact on law enforcement. So very important for the community to have complete confidence in the commitment of the police department to both protect but also to behave in this way that is protective of the sanctity of human life.
And in both ways, right? Because the police need the support of the community. And so when we draw the police and the community together,
Absolutely.
That's helping police officers do their job.
That's right.
That they know that the citizens have their back, literally and figuratively,
Right.
that the community is behind them and with them. So that mutual trust is critical both to safety and confidence of the community, but also in allowing police officers to do their job.
Yes, absolutely. And our report, I think it's clear throughout it, Supervisor, the commission respects the importance and value and professionalism of the Fairfax police officers. I had the opportunity, both of us have had the opportunity to ride with police officers, to visit with the precinct and to talk, just person to person. And I got to tell you, very impressive. And I've been professionally involved with all kind of national safety issues and security issues, and I was left very impressed. But so this idea of oversight is not a question of not trusting our police officers. It's a matter of giving the public the confidence that if something happens to them personally, they have an avenue of recourse, two or three avenues of recourse. If there's a violent situation that requires review by the internal affairs folks, there's an independent review of that. Those are good things. Those are things that are good. And if the public knows that they're there, then they're going to have greater confidence in the police department, and that's a good thing.
Right.
We should probably talk about the role of the auditor and the panel, just to clarify that.
Right. We have an auditor who will report directly to the Board of Supervisors and will oversee and really be involved in all investigations of use of force incidents by the police. Right. And that's going to be critical to confidence by the public that force is being used appropriately.
The oversight was a perfect example, I think, of the consensus and the willingness of the various interests to work together. The auditor, as you say, will monitor and review, I think are the verbs that we ended up using, to serious use of force cases, and any case that a public citizen has a concern about a use of force. So that the auditor will look in those and will not only ensure that those investigations are thorough, objective, fair, and a couple other adjectives, what we want to know that there's a fair thing. And the police officers involved understand that and helped us craft an auditor position that will treat everyone fairly in that process. The non-auditor cases, those are the ones that would come before the civilians panel. The panel would not investigate them per se. They would refer them to the police department. Police department would do the investigation, and then it could come back to the panel if the complainant was not satisfied with the answer that he or she received, a response from the police department. It would go to the panel. That's where the citizens would review the investigation, not the actual underlying event. Right. But in there is when the citizens, the 9 citizens, there'll be 9 citizens, will have the opportunity to identify concerns about policies and practices that you talked about. And those can be raised. They will hear what the auditor is doing and what the auditor is seeing in terms of policies and practices. And then they will have the opportunity the panel with the opportunity to report to the board about what they believe, mostly about the matters that come to their direct attention, but they will also hear about other things so that they will have some opportunity to provide comment. And as I understand, the board will be seeking to have a fully diverse, to the extent you can, with 9 people, but maybe you can even explain that process a little.
And I think where I see the importance really of this panel is that, there's a feeling, whether it's legitimate or not, correct or not, but a feeling that somebody says, well, sure, I can make a complaint to the police department, but it gets reviewed by the police and then somehow it's buried or whitewashed or something like that. And whether that's happened or not in the past, it won't be happening now because a panel of civilians will look over every investigation. Any citizen can come to the panel and give their complaint. And what the panel does, you're right, is not its own investigation. What it does is it makes sure that there's an actual police investigation properly done in accordance with generally acceptable procedures and everything else. And then that panel will be able to say, we, the citizens, have found that this investigation was done well, or we, the citizens, say, this investigation was not done well. And that's a public report. Everyone in the county, the media, the Board of Supervisors, everyone will know that the citizens have looked at this and said, no, this wasn't investigated well. And the power of that to say, go back and do it right, gives confidence in the community that, hey, I know that every single time that somebody has a complaint about the police, that I can now be confident it's going to get a good hearing, because if it doesn't, it's going to be on the front page of the newspaper, inconceivably. And I think it also then allows the police to have the confidence that citizens know that we're doing our job. Because I think what we're going to find is, I think we're going to find the panel saying, this was done well, this was done well. Sure, there are going to be circumstances where somebody says, this could have been done better. Things are going to improve from that. And then citizens are going to have confidence seeing their own fellow neighbors getting in there and reviewing.
I think when you put it together, and we don't want to put an overemphasis on the auditor or the panel, because I think where it really, what really is going to, should happen, and I hope does happen, is the work that Phil's subcommittee has done, the mental health subcommittee has done, in creating an environment where there's de-escalation and where you're less likely to have problems that need to be investigated or reviewed. So it's the change to a sanctity of life. It's the police chief leading the department to say, we want to avoid the situations. I mean, sometimes you're not, and sometimes things aren't going to go perfect, and that's when you look and see how can we do them better. But,
and we'll do that through annual reports.
Right.
And really, the last thing I'll say, because we're out of time, is your work and the commission's work. It really does fit together. Every piece there's a reason why that piece of the puzzle is there, and it works very well. I'd like to thank Adrian and Phil for joining me today and for the work they have done to help increase transparency in law enforcement. I hope you've enjoyed this segment of Braddock Neighborhood News. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or other needs, please contact my office at 703-425-9300 or email braddock@fairfaxcounty.gov. Tune in next month for another edition, and please remember to volunteer your time. Our community needs you.